Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, or City of Demons, as I like to say. Hollyweird, La La Land, all of the weird stuff you'd like to also add to that name. And we are broadcasting from 107.7 New Orleans, 107.7 UPRN, as well as all the other affiliates, including in the UK Deprogrammed Radio, which runs shows or terrestrial stations in London and Leeds, as well as the EU. They have other affiliates there too. And remember, folks, UPRN is also carried in multiple places around this globe, even Hong Kong. I thought that was really cool. Anyhow, I want to give a shout out to also iHeartMedia and Spreaker and SoundCloud for all these fine places that carry us. Now, today's a very special show, and I know you've heard this guest on the show multiple times. Particularly, you might remember 6 years ago, he was my original co-host. And let me give you a little backstory of here. Well, first, let me just introduce him. I mean, I've already spilled enough beans. So, Preston, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
12 years ago, you changed my life. I remember it was the 60th anniversary of Roswell. And so they, on History Channel, they had Britain's Roswell obviously, China's Roswell, which was the Dropostone incident, British Roswell, which was the Rendlesham, Texas Roswell, which was the Aurora, and Mexico's Roswell. I was like, oh my God, there's more than one, and Kecksburg, of course. I didn't believe that there was that many crash and retrievals. So not that long after, when I was living at Park La Brea, for those of you who are familiar with Los Angeles, it's on 3rd and Fairfax, I walked across the street to the Grove, went to Barnes & Noble, and asked for a UFO book. To cut the story short, the second visit, I ended up with the book that I will, to this day, over, I believe, 20 books, Preston?
23.
23. This is the book that changed my life, UFOs over California. And remember, when I was at your house, Preston, I told you the very first thing I do when I get one of your UFOs over Colorado, New York, or any of those cities, I go to the table of contents, and before reading the whole book, I'm talking about from beginning to end, I always go back and look at the crash and retrievals, landings in humanoids, and of course UFO abductions in California, and then more onboard encounters. After I read those 4, then I go back and read the entire thing. And this book, UFOs over California, literally blew my mind, Preston, because I had no idea how many crashes there were. And then when you started to write the other states, how many states have you written so far, and how many crashes have been cumulatively in all those states?
Well, let's see. It's about 6, maybe 7, and every state does have their UFO crashes, which really did shock me. I didn't really expect to find any for California, but there's all kinds of these stories coming out pretty much from each state, and yeah, cumulatively, gosh, it's got to be 50 or 60, just between New Mexico, New York, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and California.
And you made a hint at your house why you wouldn't want to cover Texas because of the sheer size of it. I couldn't even imagine how many crashes there were in Texas, especially since Fort Worth is in Texas. Isn't that where all the Roswell parts were flown to before they went to Wright Pat?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Some of them for sure. Texas is huge. It's, I think, the 3rd largest producer of UFO reports in the U.S., according to New Fork. But, Florida's way up there. That's another state I'd be like, gosh, someone's going to have to. I think actually there is a book out there, UFOs over Florida.
If I'm not mistaken, there's another book, UFOs, maybe it's Hawaii, correct me if I'm wrong here, but one that you didn't write that I've read that wasn't nearly in depth. It didn't have the resources you had. They definitely didn't look into all the cases and speak to all the witnesses. That's one thing I love about you, Preston. You look for the hard facts, and you don't stop short until you interview as many people as can be. One thing for me that will stick out in my mind that I'll never forget is when I was at your house and you had one of the children of the 200 from the Catalina incident. Can you talk about that real quick?
Yeah, that occurred in, gosh, I believe it was 2016. late June 26th. Could have been 2014, but around there. At any rate, there's been a lot of activity in this particular area. I wrote a book about it, Undersea UFO Base, which is where all this underwater UFO activity is. And Catalina Island is probably the best place to view this. There's a huge number of accounts coming from just this little island right off the Southern California coast. And one of the major sightings is for sure what happened to this Boy Scout, a bunch of other Boy Scouts. By the way, I've got 4 or 5 different Boy Scout encounters on Catalina Island alone. This is just one of them. And this guy, he was 14 years old with his friends and saw these 3 unusual lights in the sky right around dusk. A weird fog bank had just rolled in. And suddenly these lights, or one of them in particular, started shooting out other lights, which turned out to be objects, UFOs, and darting around all over the sky. And it was first maybe 10 or 20, but it kept releasing them to the point where they started to count them and watch these objects, which some were far away, but some zoomed close, and they could see this little like cupola on top, a little dome. And very interesting, because these were obviously not planes or helicopters or balloons. They were darting around, they were hovering, they were moving at right angles. Some were going in and out of the water. They were all different shapes. And I have to emphasize that because this is what really impressed the witness, is we're talking about dome-shaped craft, saucer-shaped craft, spherical, manta ray, rectangular, and it just goes on. It was...
Yeah, I remember. It was spheres, triangles, discs, square, rectangles, squares. I was amazed. 8 different shapes and sizes, if I'm recalling correctly.
And with purple lights, yellow lights, lights that are non-conventional on aircraft, which are usually red, white, and green. So these were multicolored and moving in ways that were unconventional and absolutely had no sound either. So these are sort of the things you look for as an investigator. And a lot of people are watching these things. Some people try to take cell phone cameras, and in each case, the camera drained. Got other cases just like that. That is not unusual. It's not a coincidence. I've heard it way too much. In my opinion, there's either something about the field of these objects, or they are purposefully draining the batteries or blocking the ability to take photographs. I think the latter. I don't think it's an accident.
I actually, you're absolutely right, Preston, because I've always asked the question, if we had such amazing photos and even videos from the 60s and even 50s and around that era, they were all analog. But yet everybody has a digital camera, usually in their pocket with their smartphones, but we don't have the quality or the quantity. And the only explanation I could come from asking all these people is that digital cameras don't work the same as analog because of the interference.
It could be. I think that in many cases their ETs are specifically blocking the film, because this has been going on with normal cameras as well. It's hard to say. We're getting into the realm of speculation here, but once you've got 10, 20, 30 cases yourself of cameras, people have not been able to take a picture, even though the camera was brand new or, full batteries, you start to realize that this is not a coincidence.
It's a regular occurring theme, and one that people need to take more seriously, especially those skeptics who wonder, where's all the footage? Or like the Fermi paradox, where are they? Well, they're here. They're there. They've been here. That's the thing I never understood with the Fermi paradox. It must be run by Philip Klass or the late Philip Klass and all those people.
Yeah, well, from a skeptical scientific viewpoint, I get it. The stars are very far away. And if you look at Einstein's equations, you can't travel between stars the way we understand it now. But if you talk to quantum physicists, they will disagree and say that, yeah, faster than light travel or, getting a way around it is definitely possible. So,
now, there's a question in the chat, which normally I wouldn't entertain this early, but I figured before we get into this main book I want to talk about, as well as talking about something you won. This comes from Lisa Kastner, Any comments about the Secret Space Force Solar Warden by U.S. Navy and TR-3B craft?
Well, it's not my area of study. I'm certainly watching it, and I'm absolutely convinced that there's all kinds of stuff going on that we don't know about, generally in the public. And I think there's going to be a lot of surprises, and this is one of the things that's forcing the whole disclosure movement is we've got all of that going on top of this UFO stuff, which is, I think that secret space activity is kind of what's forcing the UFO material to be pushed out in the public to sort of distract from that, which is, another secret that's kind of a more important secret at this point rather than all this old UFO stuff.
Now, let me give you a shout out and a public thank you for winning second place in the Writers of the Future Award given by L. Ron Hubbard. Between 3,000 up to 10,000 people apply. Is it every quarter, every year?
Every quarter. They're not sure exactly. It's a closely guarded secret, but we know it's several thousand is what they've said, which to me is, at least 5. So yeah, I'm super proud. The book has just come out. You can read my story there. It's along with all the other winning stories, and something I've really been trying to do for a while. I do write mostly nonfiction, but I originally wanted to be a science fiction writer and got moved into sort of writing about aliens instead, real aliens, but never sort of gave up the dream and entered that contest 47 times before I won.
And
super happy.
The title of your story, for those people who want to read it, is A Certain Slant of Light. Are you planning on writing more to submit to this to try to get that first place prize? Because you got second. I mean, that's better than 4,999 people can say, or up to 9,999 people can say.
Right. Well, the contest is only open to people who haven't professionally published 3 or more stories, or who, if you've already won, you can't enter again. So no, I'd love to, but I can't. But yeah, other people who are thinking about entering should definitely do it, because there's a big money prize for all 3 finishers. And you can enter 4 times a year. It's amazing.
And you said it's a big deal. They bring you to a nice dinner, hotel, and all of that, right?
Oh, huge deal. You get a week-long workshop with the leading writers in the field. And you go to a hotel. They pay for some of your meals, not all of them. It's amazing. They put on this gala event. You get a trophy. They pay you for your story. Your story goes in the anthology. Definitely anyone who's thinking about entering should do it. It's well supported by a lot of the leaders in the field. And boy, it's changed a lot of writers. Some of the people who have won this stuff have gone on to become New York Times bestsellers.
I would think it's a huge stepping stone for those who idolized or looked up to people like Isaac Asimov, or even L. Ron Hubbard, who was publishing the same time Isaac Asimov was. That's what he was known for long before Scientology. Right.
Yeah, this is sort of a gateway for a lot of beginning writers that does launch their career for sure. And absolutely many of them have won the top awards in the field of science fiction, like, the Huos and the Nebulas and John W. Campbell Award and so on. It's definitely a great place for new talent.
Now, I'm hoping we can dive into this one book I'm reading of yours, Inside UFOs, True Accounts of Contact, since last time we touched on Not From Here. And this book I know was published in 2017. So first, give a summation of what people can expect when they buy this book.
Yeah, it's really special to me, actually, because these are all my own cases. This is stuff you haven't heard before that has not been published. These are all first-hand cases, 10, involving people who've had very extensive cases of contact. Not, just a sighting in the sky of a light, but rather face-to-face contact, or missing time, or in most cases an onboard experience. And not just, grays, certainly, but a praying mantis type, human type, and many others.
Yeah, I noticed in Chapter 4 you talk about the giant grasshopper alien, as well as Chapter 9, the 9-foot tall with orange hair. Let me rewind that to the first chapter, Invited Aboard. What's that case about?
Yeah, this case involves Kevin Kamen. He's a Navy medic, a corpsman aboard a Navy ship. He had a really incredible experience back in the 80s. His cabin mate, the person he shared a room with on the ship, a personnel clerk, came up to him one day and says, "Guess what? I'm a UFO contactee. I've been in contact with the aliens my whole life. They've taken me when I was a kid. I've been up in their ship. I've been to their planet and everything." And Kevin's like, "Yeah, right." Kevin believed in UFOs. He always had. He'd done a report on UFOs when he was a kid. But here was his best friend basically saying that he knew aliens. So Kevin's like, "Well, if that's true, I want to meet your little green men, your little green friends." And a couple of days later, his friend shows up and says, "Well, my friends came and they just took me to your house." And he proceeded to describe Kevin's house in detail, the shag carpet, the car they had, everything, the sofa. The problem was, while it was all accurate, it was 100% accurate, it was about 10, 15 years in the past.
See, this goes to show what I've always argued, that if these aliens, all of them, I think, if they have to traverse all these distances from stars that we know is impossible if you go in a straight line, they'd have to be going through wormholes, aka Einstein-Rosen bridges, which in essence is skipping through dimensions. If that's the case, then by all means, or by default, they're time travelers.
Exactly. And this is exactly what was happening, but Kevin couldn't grasp that or didn't want to. And he's thinking, well, is my friend a CIA agent? Even that wouldn't explain this. So he's freaking out at this point when a couple of days later, his friend comes down and says, "They're here." It was noon. Lunchtime had just started. Kevin's cabin, wasn't far from the top deck. And here's his friend saying, "Just go up on deck. You'll see him. Go on." So Kevin's not believing him, goes up on deck and is shocked to see this giant craft, which is easily 3 times the ship. The ship's almost 600 feet long. This thing is to the side of the ship, a quarter mile off maybe. Enormous, this kind of diamond-shaped object, which was flashing these beautiful, beautiful prism-like colored lights. Absolutely entrancing. Kevin does the first thing anyone should do when they see a UFO is get another witness. He runs to the cook there, the mess cook, and starts shaking his shoulder, but couldn't get his attention. And boom, next thing Kevin knows is he's not on the Navy ship anymore. He's looking down at it from above, and it's receding into a tiny little dot on the ocean. He's inside the craft.
And he could see through it? I'm assuming at a window, or is the inside made of some sort of material where you could see through it?
It's very strange, and this is something I've heard from other witnesses. Wherever he looked, it would open up in sort of a transparent window. So yeah, he could look through it, but he looks down at his feet, and he's on a metallic grating, like a fire escape is how it reminded him. He's facing a wall. He's too afraid to turn around. He's next to a console. It's much too high for a human being. It's got little lights on it, and he's freaking out when suddenly he realizes he's over his hometown. Now it's day where he was, and it's day over his hometown in Kankakee, Illinois. This is not possible. So this is another indication of time travel. Anyway, the ship comes down over the local church there, and it's his mom teaching a class inside. You can see, again, through the wall of the UFO, through the wall of the church, and sees his mom teaching a class. The UFO hops over a couple of blocks to where his dad is working in the bank building. And again, he can see right to the middle of the building and sees his dad at work in a business meeting. And he hears this voice in his head speak English and, a normal kind of American accent saying, "Your parents did a good job and they are honorable people."
I'm assuming good job as far as raising Kevin?
Yeah, well, he's like, what? That's what he's thinking. That's like, wow, what does that mean? The next thing, he doesn't remember everything because a lot happened here. Next thing he knows is he's in another place, and he's looking down at what looks like an area that's been bombed, like maybe the desert, a bombing range. except it's all gray and there's all these craters. And he's like, gosh, this actually looks like the moon. But that couldn't be. When suddenly they come up over this sort of hill, and he sees the horizon line, and there, about the size of a softball, is Earth. Very small up there in the distance. He says he nearly wet his pants right there, and started asking questions like, who are you guys, and where am I, what's going on? And they answered all his questions before he could actually ask them.
Because they could already telepathically get the questions before he could vocalize them, I'm assuming, right?
Yes, he didn't get a chance to ask questions vocally, and they never spoke vocally, which is almost always what I hear. Telepathic is what he got, these voices in his head, and there was 3 different voices, all male, and they started to talk to him. He's like, where do you come from? Suddenly, this is really interesting. The room was about, he's guessing maybe 50 feet wide at this point. It expands and grows to 200 feet at least, and all these little stars appear around him. And he sees our solar system, and the sun and Earth. And way, way off in the distance, there's all these stars and stuff. He sees this little red light blinking on and off. And they said, well, that's us. The name of our planet is a little... They said some word he couldn't understand. And they said, this is where we live. And they started to tell him all about themselves, that they don't... He's like, are you going to eat me? He's really afraid. And they're like, no, we're not going to eat you. We eat fish, vegetables. We're a peaceful people. We've been observing you for a very long time, but since you started exploding nuclear bombs, it caused us and many other races to pay special attention to what you are doing, because you're causing all kinds of problems beyond our own planet and solar system.
And that's a recurring theme, is that, especially since we detonated nuclear explosives weapons, that the inclination is we figure out how to split an atom, and the very first thing we do is create a weapon of mass destruction. And I also heard from other people that this does affect other dimensions, and like you said, them. So no matter where they are in the multiverse, they are affected, which is why all eyes would be on us now.
Right. Now, we don't have any first-hand information of, that, really, other than a couple of ETs saying this here and there. So we don't know how it affects other dimensions or if it actually does. But they are extremely concerned about it, and it's brought up in case after case after case, and certainly was in this case. And they told him all kinds of stuff, that they speak all the languages on our planet, that they're in communication with the major governments, is what they said, using the word major. He doesn't know how to qualify that. Said that they were trading technology with people. Said that they've monitored us for a very, very, very long time. He asked them about Roswell. They said, yes, that did happen. But mostly they wanted to warn him about what they called a countdown clock. And
like a nuclear countdown clock, like 5 minutes to midnight sort of thing?
They didn't explain. He was a little confused until they took him, and it looked like a window or a TV screen. It felt like he was looking out and observing stuff in real life. They showed him these various scenes of earthquakes, mostly hurricanes, but tornadoes, even landslides, all kinds of natural disasters. And they said, when you started using nuclear power weapons, you started a countdown clock, and now this will happen, and you can't stop it. You will not be able to stop this from happening.
Ouch. And you know what? We're already experiencing massive hurricanes. As a matter of fact, they're adding a new category because Category 5 isn't big enough. They are adding a Category 6 for hurricanes that have winds over 175 miles per hour. And living in proximity with me, Preston, I'm sure you know the earthquakes we've had were okay, big, but not relatively nearly as big compared to the 9.0s around the world.
Yeah, can you imagine a 9-pointer in LA? Phew. I mean,
I don't want to, but unfortunately, knock on wood, I think it's inevitable.
Well, that's what the ETs are saying, and it's universal, whether you talk to Greys or Nordics, humanoids. Back in the Contactee era, it was the same message. And this is exactly what was happening to Kevin, and they were showing him it in full life. They showed him having a personal motorcycle accident and said this would happen to you.
Ouch.
And the model of motorcycle wasn't even invented yet that they were showing him.
I don't think I'd want to know if I'm going to get hurt or die in a car accident. There's certain futures that because think about this. If you're told something about your future, well, you're going to make it happen, because let's just say you lock yourself inside your house and never going outside because of fear of the unknown or fear of what's going to happen. Well, then you sort of make that future happen. And that's why I personally, I don't want to know anything about the future.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing for sure, and that's exactly what he thought. He's like, oh my God, are they showing my death? What is this? Other stuff happened he can't quite remember, but at one point he's like, what do you look like? And they said, well, our appearance sometimes frightens people.
Ooh.
And he's like, oh, well, what do you look like? And they said, well, we're not little and we're not green. Because he had said that.
Little green man, yeah.
Right, and he finally just turns around and looks at him, and he is not happy because they are 15 feet tall.
Whoa!
He's estimating now, but he is a trained observer, and I've usually heard these types of ETs. He saw them praying mantis type ETs. They were bone white, very milky white, tall, very stick-like limbs. Kind of a stick-like body, too. What was really big was their head, which was massive. So big, in fact, that one of their eyeballs was bigger than his own head, big like a basketball, he said. And they were sitting on these three kind of looked like stone white chairs on a dais in the center of the room. One of them gets up, takes 2 steps, and is across the room, and is right next to him. Kevin looks up and sees how truly tall they are. He says they're 15 feet tall. And I really talked with him on this because I don't hear this a lot. I have heard a couple now, which I'll definitely have to tell you about. Man, oh man. But yeah, he says they were 15 feet tall, not shorter than that. More than twice his height, higher than a basketball board, So he was very careful at estimating them. And one of them starts fussing around with the dials and turns to him and says, so would you like to visit our planet? And Kevin said no. He wanted to go home.
Oh, I would have said yes, no matter how frightening, but that's me and you.
Yeah, we've had more exposure. We've had time to think about this. He didn't.
Yeah.
Suddenly he's next to a 15-foot tall bug, and he felt like he might end up as a specimen. He really did.
Yeah, I would think so too. If it's 2.5 times the size as far as tallness of me, I mean, and looking like you said a bug, right?
Yeah, he felt like a little, pet next to them. Their intelligence radiated around him to the point where he was completely overwhelmed by it.
You also mentioned that they were in diamond-shaped craft, and that reminds me of, I believe it's the Cash Landrum incident in Texas. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was a dark metal-shaped craft. He described this as looking almost crystal-like.
Oh, okay.
So it was much, much larger. That one was releasing sort of heat and fire. That may have very well been an Earth craft that was sort of a reverse engineered deal. Hard to say, but it was surrounded by helicopters, if you'll recall.
Yeah, about 15 to 20 of them were surrounding and following. That's right. And like you said, the heat, because Betty Cash, and I forget what Landrum's first name was, they had radiation burns, and they were in the hospital for at least a week, including the grandson.
Yeah, Colby and Vicky Landrum.
Yes.
They all suffered burns, Betty most severely. And that's not terribly unusual. I have to say, I generally think UFOs are not out to hurt people. I don't think they're dangerous or something we have to be afraid of, but you certainly have to be cautious. And yes, they do hurt people. I mean, there's just no way around it, because there's a number of cases where people have simply gotten too close to these objects and suffered what amounts to radiation sickness. Kevin's encounter was entirely benevolent, but he found it very frightening. The ET reaches out, grabs his shoulder. He got a good look at the hand at that point. And he blacks out and wakes up. He's in his cabin on the ship. He's covered in sweat. He's hyperventilating. His bed is surrounded by a screened-in curtain. suddenly the screen opens and there's his friend grinning from ear to ear saying, "So, how did you like your ride?" Well, Kevin didn't like it. He was very upset. He refused to speak to that guy again the whole time they were on the ship, pretty much. Was no longer friends with him. And get this, forgot most of what happened. Remembered being taken on board the craft, didn't remember what they looked like, didn't really remember anything, just bits and flashes of weird stuff, like seeing his parents or something, and things like this.
Did they come out in the dreams, I'm assuming, later on?
It came out right after he was left the service. He came out and he was watching a nature program and saw a praying mantis ET nature show, and it does a close-up of a praying mantis, and that broke the walls of amnesia pretty much instantly and sent him, to the floor as he recalled all this stuff that happened, some years earlier.
Truthfully, of all the different species that I've read about, I think the praying mantis, especially the super tall ones, would probably be the ones that I fear the most. Especially, I'm sure you've seen Tom Reed's drawing of one with the way they sit with like a sort of an M with their legs because they're so tall and the little sack underneath them.
Yeah, I think it's very frightening for sure, this experience, but not for all people, I have to say. And one of the first words out of Gray's mouth is, "Don't be afraid, we won't hurt you." And in most cases, they do live up to that promise. They're not there to hurt people. It's our own prejudices and our own ignorance, our own fear of things that are different that causes us to be so emotional. And it really perplexes them, absolutely.
Now, let me argue for the other side. What about the people who say they were harmed, even though the ETs didn't mean harm, when they were probing them or something like that against their will?
Yeah, this is an enigmatic phenomenon that is very hard to get a handle on. Abduction, the whole abduction phenomena, is a crime on any country of our planet. It's pretty much illegal to kidnap someone against their will. Even if it's an emergency, say like it's an emergency doctor trying to save someone's life, that's not an excuse, even if there's a pre-life contract or anything like this, because people are being pulled against their will, and you just can't rationalize that. You can't, walk that back in any regard, and that kind of keeps me from saying fully that, fully embracing this phenomena. But if you actually study their behavior of UFOs, it falls under the exact same umbrella as human behavior, but is skewed towards the more positive. Yes, there are negative encounters. Yes, people are medically harmed. But I can also march out 300 cases. This is the subject of my latest book, The Healing Power of UFOs. 300 documented cases of people who have been healed intentionally. And most of these people have a very good viewpoint of the ETs, call them their friends, call them their family, are very happy to have been healed of literally all kinds of injuries, minor illnesses like flu or stomach ache, backache, cuts, bruises, serious diseases like diphtheria, tuberculosis, diabetes, arthritis, jaundice, you name it, heart disease, and of course 40 cases of cancer. So this speaks to a very benevolent side of the ETs that has been largely ignored due to a media sort of
fear,
a desire to focus on, lurid stories. The truth is, if you look at this objectively, there is a very positive side to it and a negative side to it, which is what we see exactly with humanity.
The book you wrote on UFO healings, if I'm not mistaken, this case that I'm about to say came from that book, because I've read almost all of your 23 books, is the one where this woman was, I think, sailing or on a small boat, and a storm was hitting her and she would have drowned, but something brought her to shore.
Yeah, there's a number of cases where people have had their life saved. There was a case where people were on a boat that was about to sink. A UFO hovered above them, allowing the rescuers to pinpoint them. There's another case of a lady who was drowning in a river when ETs pulled her out. Another case of a lady who was being assaulted by a rapist when a UFO showed up and drove the man away. There's another case of a guy who's driving down the road. This UFO shines a light down in front of him, and it's a mattress in front of him on the road, a big one. He would have crashed it and hurt himself bad for sure. A long list of cases of people who have been helped by ETs in a wide variety of ways. So absolutely, yeah, these guys are sometimes, friends in high places, for sure.
Now, let me get to Taylor's extraterrestrial friends. What happened with Taylor?
Very interesting case. This guy is currently a retired chiropractor, and really nice guy, kind of shy and, I don't want to say timid, but introverted maybe. Very smart. When he was 9 years old, he wasn't doing that well in school at the time. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and his mom sends him out to mail this letter. He's 9, and it's about 9 o'clock at night, or just before 9. The post office is going to close shortly. They live just a few minutes away. He mails the letter. He's walking back, and he looks up because there's this thing over his head. He's next to a big 2-story building, and this thing is right over the building. All he can see is this kind of metal lattice work. It's huge. It's a ship of some kind. He's not thinking UFOs. He's, pretty darn young. Had not really heard much about this sort of thing when it sends down this powerful beam of light. And next thing he knows, some time has passed, and he feels different. Now, I've had a lot of people try to describe this to me, and he sort of struggled. He says, Preston, I was more aware than I've ever been. I had like a mini enlightenment. I suddenly felt like I was smarter and more intelligent. This is something that turns up in a lot of cases where people will actually, their IQ will improve, tens of points, 20s of points.
And psychic powers too, right?
Right. And this is what happened to him. He's suddenly like a lot more aware, runs home, tells his mom, like, oh my God, you'll never guess what happened. And she's like, where were you? Go to your room. And she was very upset with him. So he didn't really get to speak to her about it. She wasn't really open to it. And over the next couple of days, he started to recall what happened. Because, he had about an hour of missing time. He got home like 10 o'clock or something. So he recalls this light hitting him, and next thing he knows, he's on board this craft, and there are 2 human-looking beings in front of him. I guess you would call them Nordics. I don't like that term because I think that implies white skin and blue eyes and blonde hair, which was true in this case, but it's certainly not true in all cases. I've talked to people who've seen so-called Nordics, and they are Middle Eastern-looking, or they're Mesoamerican, and so on. But he describes these very fair-haired, bright-eyed human beings who were very muscular, looked genetically perfect, very beautiful, wearing these jumpsuits with sort of a black, I believe it was a black jumpsuit with a white stripe. And they had this long philosophical conversation with him, which for the life of him he can't quite recall. But it was a long conversation for sure, and he felt like these guys were like almost angelic in their perfection. Just amazing people.
Your description of them reminds me of Adamski's drawings, except for the different color jumpsuits. As far as perfect build, like you said, in this case, blue eyes. And I'm glad you mentioned that Nordic implies just those blue-eyed, blonde-haired, because like you said, there are several different types of human-looking extraterrestrials, like you said, from Middle Eastern to Asian even. As a matter of fact, there was this famous case in Japan about 200 years ago where this woman came what they thought was a boat and ended up on shore, and she came out. I don't know if she said much, but she got back in the so-called boat and disappeared underwater. The point is I personally, my own belief is that Homo sapiens exists on more than this planet.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, because we're dealing with ETs that look essentially just like us. That raises serious questions about human origins for sure. And I just don't see any way around it. And certainly explains some of the missing links and the the lack of understanding we have of how evolution actually occurs. It's very interesting when you combine this with, the major sciences. There's going to be some major overhaul needing in virtually all our sciences. Anthropology, for sure, is one of them, but all the sciences are going to have huge wake-up calls when this evidence that we already have, by the way, the crashed UFOs, comes really
Right.
to full attention of humanity. It's only being studied by a very small percentage of people. We are not putting our resources toward this in a way we really should.
Agreed. Definitely agreed. And us using radio signals to contact them like SETI does, when we received what other people say was in fact a crop circle written in binary from them, which showed their DNA structure, that they were made of silicon, but instead of showing a satellite dish, it showed an entire different method for sending transmissions. Personally, I think radio is so outdated, they might be using light.
Yeah, the things they can do with light, I think, is one of the great lessons they have to teach us, that we can use light to levitate, we can use light to heal, we can use light to open wounds and close them up, to basically permeate solid objects. Their use of light is extraordinary. And for a good example is, what happened to Taylor. He had several, he started having more encounters. They moved out onto a farm in the sort of backwoods of Missouri, and he was having more encounters with grays. He was having missing time, and he basically grew up with this phenomenon. There was one incident where a UFO showed up, and he could move around, but his family was frozen in place. So basically, the ET stopped time and abducted him. But he had this experience where the roof turned transparent. He's like, how do you take me through the wall? And they showed him twice how they do it. Basically, they just polarize matter in a way that it becomes transparent. It's permeable. It's an energetic field.
It begs the question that if his family was frozen in time, yet he wasn't, that maybe he is a special one, and maybe his soul is that of, say, because if you believe in past lives, well, who's to say that your soul didn't live on another planet before you live now? And that could be this case with Taylor, couldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And if you look into the research on past lives, it's very compelling. It's absolutely bordering on conclusive. The work of Dr. Ian Watson, for sure, has pretty much proven past life is real. And this does come up within UFOs sometimes. ETs do tell people, oh, you are one of us. You were with us in a past life. I believe that was true in the Tujunga Canyon case with Ann Druffel and D. Scott Rogo, and in a number of other cases. It didn't turn up in Taylor's case so much. They didn't really tell him why they were in contact with him. But he had another case where he's like, how do you move around darting like that? Doesn't that hurt your bodies? And they said, this is how we do it. And they put him in a chair that filled with liquid, and he was forced to breathe the liquid at the same time. This is exactly what happened to Betty Andreasson. He has, of course, not read her books. He hasn't read any UFO books. But he described essentially the same thing, the same darn chair, coming even the way it comes down from the ceiling and fills with this liquid that's not water, precisely. They showed him all kinds of things. He had this pimple appear on his face one day, and his wife's like, what is that? And he's like, well, maybe it's an implant. Well, he got abducted that night, and the Gray looked at him. He says, this is what the Gray said. This is ridiculous. This is the third implant that you've gone through. You've got to stop doing that. Now we're going to have to take this one out. And he's like, no, you don't. That's an implant. You don't have to do that. I'm sorry. I won't bother it. He's like, no. Now that you know where it is, we have to take it out, and we're going to put another one in where you will never find it.
Interesting. I've actually never heard of an implant in their face, but at the same time, after Dr. Roger Lear started removing implants, I got stories that, for instance, people would be abducted and they would literally see their eyeball be removed where it's still with the ligament attached to their inside of their head, and they would place an implant there. And the explanation was by the ETs was that we're placing it there so you don't remove it.
Yeah, I think it's also they're looking basically through people's eyes.
Yes.
I just wonder about that. I can't say that that's actually true, but I mean, it is a peculiar location for an implant. This happened to Betty Andreasen. John Carpenter, a Midwest abduction researcher, had a guy that happened to, and as a result of that operation, it cured his color blindness. Dr. Lear had a case where he wrote about where a man's eyeballs were actually removed, physically excised out of his head and not returned. He was permanently blind, but he seemed to be fine with it.
35 years ago, Preston, when I heard of alien implants, to me, it's like, okay, so they could track us, but look at the technology we have now. I think, like you said, they are tapping into all of our senses. They can know our blood pressure. They can know our heartbeat rate. They could see us. They could feel all our senses, what we smell, what we touch, all of it. That's what my impression is at this point.
Yeah, we don't know. I do think that they're really on top of things. We certainly know that they're able to abduct people pretty much anywhere. Abductees have a tendency to move from state to state, city to city, on the run. It never stops the abductions from happening. And if we've got abductions that take place on subways, from buses, off
and
trains,
airplanes too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just ridiculous. Out of hotels, crowded condominiums,
jails.
I was not able to confirm anyone of a jail, and I did look for that. But if you know of one, I'd sure love to know about it, because I wrote this chapter in one of my books, UFOs Over Prisons. They are absolutely interested in all our installations and have targeted a wide number of prisons across the world. And these are real close-up sightings where they hover over prisons for hours at a time. And my guess is, yes, they probably are abducting people, but I would love to hear a first-hand case.
And you know what? When I come across that, I'm definitely going to introduce them to you. As a matter of fact, every time I find something that's original that you already don't know of, you're the person I call and be like, Preston, hey, what do you think about this? Because you've been involved in this for so long. Like I said in the very beginning of this show, and I say every show, if it wasn't for you, I would have thought there would still be only Roswell, Kecksburg, Texas, Aurora, Texas, Mexico, and Rendlesham, and Dropostone in China. And I was blown away. As a matter of fact, in the comments here, someone says that Richard Dolan estimates there's been about 200 crash and retrievals around, I believe it said the Earth. That sounds somewhat similar to me, because Timothy Good says a very super conservative estimate is 100. And he said that's super conservative.
Yeah, it's way conservative. If we're going to be realistic, it's probably closer to 1,000, 500, 1,000. Just judging from what, I've done research on these 4 or 5 states, because you have to say, those are the ones we know about. Those are the ones that leaked out. How many leak out? Probably most don't. So if you could probably times that by 10. And so we're already well over 100 with just a few states here.
And in the federal handbook for firefighters described what to do in case there's a crash and retrieval. Wasn't that modeled off a crash in New York in the 80s?
I'm not aware of that. I do know the manual you're talking about. And it's extraordinary. We live in almost kind of 2 worlds. There's sort of the mainstream skeptic world, where even though most people do believe in UFOs, they believe it's a real phenomena. They believe our government is covering it up. It's not talked about. It's not taught in schools. It's relegated to radio shows like yours, occasional TV programs that still, are not like 60 Minutes type things. It's when it gets on the news, it's not a lot. It's given brief mention. It's sometimes even ridiculed. We're still not there yet. And when in fact we do have the evidence. It's really frustrating. And I think we're at a point now where the giggle factor is going to start going away. You'll remember just recently there was that press conference at the White House about the Pentagon disclosure, where Sarah Huckabee Sanders was actually asked about UFOs. And when that reporter brought up the subject of UFOs, sure enough, A wave of giggles swept across the press room.
That's the way they've
Gosh.
conditioned us. 200, 300 years ago, if people talked about it, they would not think you're crazy. I mean, that's why I believe personally, in my case, as far as what I understand, whenever in history they talked about elves or dwarves or fairies, they're describing extraterrestrials because they're interacting with something that's non-human.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people out there who aren't giggling about this. This is a very serious phenomenon for a lot of people. I know our government is neck deep in this stuff. If you start researching Air Force bases and UFOs, you will see that most of them have had a history of encounters stretching back to at least 1947, the modern age of UFOs, which coincides exactly with the nuclear age. Again, probably not a coincidence, as many researchers have pointed out. But yeah, I mean, there are crashed UFOs in a lot of our air bases. There are a lot of people who are studying this at very high levels of government. We're throwing all kinds of money towards it. Boy, we need this to come out if we want to save our planet.
And I would really hope, Preston, it's in our lifetime because our technology is progressing so fast. There has to be a point that at their minimal technology, where they were, say, 10,000, 100,000, or half a million years, is where we're going to start to intersect. So I would think at some point they can't cover it up anymore.
No, they can't. What we have is a situation where a president has seen a UFO, not just the U.S. I mean, there's the former Mexican president has seen UFOs, Brazilian president. We've got numerous senators. We've got representatives. We have mayors. We have generals. We have colonels. We have commanders, captains, pilots. The defense minister of Canada, for Pete's sake. We have a lot of our world leaders who have seen this stuff and made public statements. That's not the disclosure we're quite looking for, but it's what is it then?
There's two questions in chat I'm going to ask you, and let me say this for all the listeners. If you guys are listening via YouTube, please write your questions in capital letters so I know it's a question for me to ask as opposed to just your comments. The first one comes from Carl Egan Wilkstrom. Do you know transparent creatures?
That is, yes. It's a great question, Carl. Most people describe, when they see an ET, what we would assume to be flesh and blood, for sure. But this is not how they always appear. Some appear via a beam of light and are initially transparent. Some come through the wall. Some start out as a ball of light and then elongate and widen and turn into a creature. And some are absolutely transparent, like ghosts, but they're, your typical gray or humanoid, or even the praying mantis. The praying mantis in particular sometimes will be seen in a flickering way where they flicker in and out, almost as if they're interdimensional. So this does turn up. It's not super common. I think that ETs do have the ability to manifest fully physically and then pull up to a higher vibrational level, where they're not what we would call physical, but is kind of a misnomer because they're up at the vibrating in sort of an astral plane level, perhaps, doesn't mean it's purely energetic. It's just a finer form of matter.
Here's another question. This is from Lisa Kastner. Any comments about hybrid black-eyed children?
I've never run across a black-eyed child case myself. I have talked to a few people, and so I don't know quite what to say about that in terms of the black-eyed children. The hybrid phenomena is for real. I think that they've infiltrated our society on multiple levels. Probably a lot of people out there are hybrids and don't know it. All of humanity, like we were talking earlier, we don't know precisely how humanity has evolved, but we do know the Greys are interbreeding with us, which presumes that there's a similar genetic structure. There seems to be a lot of interest in genetics up and down through this field. There's a very strong medical theme. So I think that in some cases there are aliens living among us who know they're aliens and go off and board UFOs and report back to their commander, so to speak. Others who are aliens and don't know it, and all ranges of hybrids in between. And no, I just don't think that humans necessarily evolved on Earth, and we are all potentially extraterrestrials. So that makes the whole hybrid phenomena a very tricky subject to sort of give a definitive answer on.
Here's another one for you. Paper Crane Wishes. What are some good resources regarding past life research?
Regarding past life research, definitely I would look into Ian Watson. There's a number of books out there on past lives. Helen Wambach, that's another author who's done some great research on it. I forget the name of the other author, but there's a lot of great information out there, not only in books, but on the internet. And it's very interesting. People who have phobias, people who have intense interests, people who have are drawn to certain areas or like certain foods or cultures. Even birthmarks have been traced in many cases, mind you, to wounds that people died of in an immediate past life. And the evidence on this is fairly conclusive. Case after case where someone has been stabbed and they have a birthmark there, or their fingers were cut off, and their next life they have stunted fingers or bent fingers, or a scar along their throat, which turned out that they were decapitated. All kinds of stuff like this. It's really extraordinary, and we all have past lives. There is life after death. We have the basically conclusive proof of all this in the public arena. It's a shame that we call this stuff paranormal or supernatural, because it really isn't. It's just a little bit misunderstood. But we're now at the point where, we know there are other dimensions. We've proven this through mathematics. There are enough ghost cases, photographs of ghosts, to prove ghosts are real. There are enough near-death experiencers that we've constructed a pretty firm outline of what people experience when they have a near-death experience. So we know a whole wide variety of paranormal, and it's not paranormal at all. It's just misunderstood.
Here is another one for you. This comes from InfoWars WikiLeaks. Do you have any physical, tangible evidence of UFOs or aliens relating to your story?
Oh yeah, there is absolutely tangible evidence. Do I personally have it? This depends on what you call evidence. The evidence for UFOs comes in a wide variety of forms. It's obviously not just eyewitness testimony. There are many metal fragment cases. There are 1,000 plus, 8,000, landing trace cases. There's medical evidence. We have cases where we have before and after x-rays of tumors that have been removed. There's, of course, the implant evidence, which is outstanding. It's smoking gun evidence. I have a case where the people sent me x-rays of this BB-like object beneath the person's tooth. It's absolutely inexplicable. I've shown it to 2 doctors. They both diagnosed it as a foreign body, as did the original doctor. That is pretty darn good evidence. Is it proof? Well, that depends where you're coming from. It's certainly proof enough in a court of law to prove this is a real subject. Yes, there's a mountain of evidence. The best evidence we have is still not available to the public, and that's the crashed saucers and the bodies. But there's going to come a time when that is available to us.
And like you said in the past, we have a right to know. We should be able to go see the Roswell wreckage in a museum or any of these wreckages. I mean, this is people who are in government. Who says they know more than us to babysit us? I mean, things like this always bother me, and I get that they're elected, but that doesn't make it to where they have to hold these secrets. Okay, fine, they're trying to argue national security, but really at this point, you want to argue national security when there's so much knowledge that's to be had? It just blows my mind, Preston.
Yeah, well, it's not the elected officials for the most part who are keeping the secret. It's the highest levels of the military. It's the military-industrial complex. It's the 1%ers. The MJ-12 thing is, I'm sure, real. And at very high levels, yeah, I can see why they were concerned. When these ETs showed up and started mapping our nuclear bases, our missile silos, our dams, our prisons, our rivers, they, our Air Force bases, from a military standpoint, this is very concerning. And for every governmental UFO study official, like Blue Book, Condon Committee, and so on, to say that UFOs do not represent a national security threat is ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. Of course they do. If they're abducting people, if they're hovering over our Air Force bases, that is a clear and present danger for sure. So that's, I think, where they're coming from. And I get it. But now, if this is a real threat, then the best thing to do is to alert everybody. And let's pour all our knowledge and all our resources towards protecting humanity if that is, the way they feel. But no, they're not doing it. And so there is a constitutional crisis. They don't have the authority or the right to keep this knowledge secret. Not anymore. So there's going to be some legal troubles coming up for some people.
At least, at the very least. Now, here's a question/comment. It ends in a question mark. It's from Lisa again. People being pregnant and 3 months later, baby's gone?
Yes, I ran across this back in 1988 when I first got into this subject. It was someone from work. Her daughter was having visitations by Greys, and they ended up having a whole series of visitations, and the mother was taken on board and shown these babies. So that were not entirely human, some of them. This does happen. The most extreme case I've run across personally involved a Canadian couple. The wife was 6.5 months, almost 7 months pregnant when she lost her baby.
Wow, third trimester.
Yeah, and mind you, she had sent me the information. I saw the photograph. She was pregnant. They'd built the nursery. They told the whole family. This was a big deal. She was having a lot of trouble getting medical care. Then her, baby disappears, and she got bumped up to very high levels of medical care very easily. And it was very kind of puzzling to her why that happened. But as you and I know, and certainly because medical professionals recognized what was going on here was not, conventional or not standard.
I was going to say, because they know something, or they've been briefed at that level. I would think if she's getting the extra medical care and coverage right fairly quickly after this, I would think that she was probably being watched from that point on, because if they took that baby once, if she gets pregnant again, I would think that she would be a target for them to take that baby another time.
Yeah, my heart goes out to that couple. They were a young couple having a lot of, financial troubles. They had just, she moved from a foreign country and was still having difficulties with citizenship and things like this, and didn't speak perfect English, but they did have a history of UFO encounters. She's very spiritual, and it wasn't a negative experience for them overall. She was ultimately okay with it, she told me. That's difficult for me to grasp, having a child out there that is yours and has been taken away by your space friends. But that's, gosh, what are you going to do?
Agreed. Now, here's something that I learned first from David Jacobs, and it really scared me. He said that in the last 25 years, because he hasn't been doing as much research lately, but his latest book, Walking Amongst Us, he said that a lot of the abductees are being taken on board ships, and they're shown their hybrids who look more and more human, which you would think would happen after having so many generations mating with the hybrids. You would think that they would have more human characteristics. Well, he said a lot of these abductees were reporting that the ETs were showing them like scenes of humanity. For instance, a grocery store. And then they were told, what do you do? What do you buy? Or a scene like a kitchen. What's this? The microwave oven. How do you operate it? Or a door. They couldn't figure out what to do with the doorknob. Things like that, which to me shows that they were getting ready to be walking amongst us. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I know about David Jacobs' research, and he takes a dimmer viewpoint, I think, than a lot of other researchers. He's pretty worried about the future of humanity, and apparently he's got the cases to back his viewpoint up. I don't agree with it entirely. I think that this sort of thing has probably been going on for a very long time, and I don't see the ETs as, taking over our planet and eating us for lunch type of thing at all.
If
Yeah,
they did, they would have
I,
done so for a long time ago. Why wait for us to get this technologically advanced and then take us over or take our planet over when they could have done so, say, 150 years ago?
well, maybe they didn't have the hybrids back then.
True.
One thing I do know is that the ETs, I mean, humanity is not going to go extinct. First thing ETs do to people is when they're taken on board is get their reproductive material. So to presume that they're only producing hybrids, I think would be a bit naive. My guess is they're producing humans as well, because they can. And who's to say that grays are not essentially human and always have been? If they're interbreeding, and creating hybrids. Uh, where do the grays come from? We don't even know. Is it Zeta reticula? Well, this is what Betty Hill was told. And there's a few other cases that you can point to that seem to verify that. But we don't know. I mean, there's been lots of other star systems mentioned, and often grays will, not often, but certainly enough times, grays have said, we're from your future. One day you will look like us. You are us. We are you. So I think my point is that, the hybrid question is very difficult to answer. As I mentioned earlier, we might already be essentially alien. We might all have, souls that have incarnated over and over again on different planets. This is entirely possible, and I know how it sounds to a skeptic, but this is what the evidence is showing us. And if ETs are going to start landing on our planet in large numbers, well, that's entirely possible. We don't know. David Jacobs' scenario of an alien invasion, we can't completely discount it.
And it very well could be one sect of all the different species as opposed to all of them. And very well they might be wanting to integrate with us, not because they want to take over, but maybe because they want to learn our ways. I mean, this is just pure speculation on my part. But you're right. You have to take his research, but you can't apply it to everything.
Right. There's many different types of ETs. Even the word gray is a misnomer. There's many different types of so-called grays. And if you look at the diversity on our planet between, races, this is what we see, among grays, among hybrids, or praying mantis type, and among the human-looking ones. So there's a wide variety of races of ETs, just like there is here on our planet. And it could very well be that the ETs are coming to help us. The Native American cultures, if you look at the research of R.E. Six Killer Clark, which I think is probably not nearly as slanted in fear as a lot of the American research has been.
Yeah, she's been on the show a couple of times. If I'm not mistaken, her tribe, or at least the tribe that she was adopted by, didn't they harbor an alien that had crashed its craft and they hid it because that being was scared of the government, and for whatever reason they harbored it, and I believe either a week to I don't know how long it lived, but unfortunately it died.
Yeah, gosh, who's the guy who's told that story? I forget his name. I'm not sure it was Artie. She may have brought it up. But yeah, I love her research because it shows, how people are viewing this in other countries and within, the Native American culture here in the United States. One of the guys I interviewed for the book Inside UFOs is a Native American, and his encounters were decidedly positive. He started out with his family sort of watching these NLs, nocturnal lights, over Lake Pend Oreille on the Idaho Panhandle. And it was always a very fun experience. One time, one of these UFOs comes really low, and his daughter, who was very young at the time, says, Daddy, they're talking to me. What should I say? And Stan, who's the guy I interviewed, says, well, tell them you love them. And so she says in her sweet little voice, I love you. And this UFO flares up bright blue and comes swooping down over the family and then takes off. It was a very positive experience for them. And he had an experience, if I may just real quickly, where he's driving along the base of Thunder Mountain early one morning. This is some years later. It's daytime. He's got his dog there. He's in his pickup when suddenly he hears this whooshing sound, and this giant silver spherical-shaped craft, like a mirror silver, lands in front of him on the road. It covers the entire breadth of the road there, the width. It's huge. And out steps this beautiful man in a blue jumpsuit with silver boots. He's got long, dark hair, dark eyes, large nose, dark skin. He looked Middle Eastern, maybe Arabic, and had this beatific expression on his face, this smile. And Sten was just overcome with longing and kind of thinks to himself, oh my gosh, take me with you. Because he looks upon these ETs as his ancestors. He calls them the Wojay. That's what they call.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's one of your chapters.
Right. Yeah. And so for him, it was a very positive experience. And he wanted to go with this ET, but the ET's like, no. And immediately turned around and went back into the ship and basically just came down, apparently, to say hi, and sort of connect there on a personal face-to-face level. It was a very benevolent encounter and a far cry from, the negative abductions by grays that we often hear here.
There's another comment/question. It has a question mark, but it's more of a comment in the chat, and then I'm going to go through some more chapters. This says UFOs featured in medieval time or paintings?
Yes. And now if you look at the whole phenomenon of ancient aliens, the best evidence out there, it's in petroglyphs, it's in hieroglyphics in the Egyptian times. There are pre-Columbian stone artifacts. There are drawings in the desert, like the Nazca lines. There are pyramids and other structures. But the paintings, actually, it's not Renaissance. It's from the Middle Ages, about the year 500, all the way up through the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, depicting UFOs, usually in conjunction with Jesus or Mother Mary. And these are not like super hard to, symbolic, say, or hard to interpret. These are classic UFOs in several of these cases. And by that, I mean they're saucer-shaped. They've got portholes. There's a seat inside. There's a person sitting in there. It's sending out a beam of light. And other people are like on the ground pointing at it. It's obviously a UFO as we, see them today. And a lot of, must be 20, 30 of them at least.
At least, yeah, I was going to say at least because like you said, it goes back to Egyptian, to Greek, to Roman, to, even a few hundred years ago.
The Romans called them flying shields. So they knew about them.
And the Hindus called them Vimanas.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So this is a very old phenomenon.
Let me pick a few more chapters so I can get as much as we can in the almost 30 minutes we have left because I want to leave a couple minutes to plug in everything that you have to plug in, including your website where people can buy your books, etc. Let's talk about flying saucer sickness.
Yeah, this was a guy interviewed who is currently a professor at a college and did not want his name used, which I respect. He was as a kid, he lived in a small town in Texas. Back in the 1950s, he did a paper route. He's just a young kid and would deliver papers each morning. And he's doing this early one morning. It's still dark. And he's pedaling up the hill and he's getting ready to deliver all these papers when he sees this light zooming from across the horizon towards him. And he looks up at it thinking, well, what the heck is this? And suddenly it sends down a beam of light which strikes him. And the next thing he knows, he's no longer on his bike. He's standing next to it. And he's looking up at this object which zooms off. And he looks around him and he's like, oh my gosh, it's daytime. That's weird. And he's like, I must be late. Well, he starts delivering the papers as fast as he could. And boy, he was late. His customers were very upset. He got home. His mom was upset. His employer was upset. And he felt really strange. He felt kind of tired and went straight to bed, which is something he often did, having woken up so early. But this was different. And this tiredness progressed over the next few days to the point where he had trouble getting out of bed. And finally, he just couldn't even function. He couldn't get up. He was having trouble walking. They rushed him off to the emergency room and were unable to diagnose him. They gave him a sort of vitamin cocktail and sent him home. And he had to be excused from all physical activities for the entire summer, couldn't do them, and had what looks like radiation sickness, perhaps, or some form of it. It wasn't officially diagnosed, and he did not tell them that, oh, by the way, I was beamed by this weird plane, which is what he thought at the time. He thought, gosh, it must have been an atomic plane, and it hit me. But he didn't want to tell people because he was embarrassed and didn't understand it. And thankfully, over about 3 or 4 months, his energy did finally return. But that certainly wasn't the end of his experiences. He, earlier on, around this time perhaps, but he kind of forgot about it, he was in his bedroom on the second story when suddenly he's looking out at night and he starts screaming because there's this little bald man with beady eyes or weird eyes. He doesn't really remember, but the eyes were strange, looking at him. Now, it's impossible because he's on the second story, so this guy had to be floating. And he screams, his 2 sisters come running in, and he's like, look at the little man. And they look, and there's nothing there. It had gone away. And that sort of became a family joke or a family incident they always talked about. Like, remember when he saw the little man? And they always did, but he didn't know what to make of it. And it wasn't until years later he's like, oh my God, I had missing time. I saw a UFO. And he started reading books. He's like, oh my God, these are abductions. And so he was pretty fully read up on UFOs when he went and he decided he's going to go see a hypnotist. This is the only case, or there's 2 cases in the book where people tried hypnosis. Most of them don't involve hypnosis. While I think hypnosis is a great tool and is valid and can legitimately uncover memories of an abduction, I wanted to include cases that didn't use hypnosis just to throw away any hypothesis of false
recall,
memory.
You mean, right?
Right. The fact is, any explanations of fantasy-prone personality or hypnotically generated memories is not true and is not backed up by evidence. And I can prove that because most of these cases in this book don't involve hypnosis, and the cases that do reflect exactly what people are recalling consciously. So just let's put that to rest right here and now.
Before I get to some more of the chapters, there's some things in the chat that I'm obligated to ask you. This comes from Christy Belly. Do you think timelines are collapsing?
Time is a very tricky thing. It's very hard to say. We don't have a complete understanding of time, and certainly the way the ETs do, if they can stop time, if they can, time travel. It's hard to say, like, is time speeding up? Is it slowing down? I don't know that that's necessarily true. There is word that, there's going to be fundamental differences in the way we experience and view the universe. This is a message that comes up again and again. We're moving into the 5th dimension, they will tell witnesses. We're moving up a vibrational level. Now, this could lead to some changes in how we perceive time and how time flows, or our abilities to, manipulate time. So it's all very interesting, and I think definitely one of the things to keep an eye on as we, move forward with this subject and into the future.
There is someone wrote here about when we were talking about ancient aliens, the book of Ezekiel, and I already wrote in the comment that I found personally myself reading through the book of Ezekiel, there was more UFO ET references in that book than throughout the entire Bible. But what's your take on? That's all it says is book of Ezekiel ?
Yeah, well, it's been pointed to as a UFO incident by many researchers. Barry Downing, of course, was the first guy to really look at the whole biblical UFO phenomena. But a lot of researchers have looked into this, and for sure, some of the instances in our history that we would label as angelic or religious were probably ET. Not all of them. I will say that the evidence for angels in the traditional sense is compelling, There are an enormous number of eyewitness testimonies supporting the evidence, the presence, the existence of angels as we would think of them, benevolent spirits. But there's one lady I interviewed. The ETs told her flat out, yeah, some of the incidents you have recorded in your religious writings were really us. Flat out, they told her that. They told her all kinds of stuff, that they had actually manipulated the genes in dogs and cats so that they could experience more human-like emotions so that they would make better companions for us. That I thought was kind of interesting. But yeah, the Bible, it's not my area of expertise, but you'll look at a number of sacred writings across the world, and you will see that the ET explanation fits pretty darn tightly, fits well into a number of these stories.
This actually reminds me of the conversation we had, a week, 10 days ago at your house when I was suggesting that possibly the reason why angels were drawn with wings is to show that they flew. And you pointed out that not all of them, as a matter of fact, there are winged creatures. And that opened up a whole new area in my head. So I want to thank you for that. There's some more questions for you, Preston. Let me get to them here. Roel Pfeiffer Muller. Roel, I want to thank you for always amazing comments. He says, are you acquainted with the essays of Branton Files? Branton.
No, I can't say that I am. Okay. Should I be?
Roel, hopefully you can expand on that, and I will absolutely pass it to Preston. Okay. Gil Aslay. A lot of humans go missing every year, I hear.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, mention that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a real problem. It's received a lot of attention recently, thanks to research, by David Paulides, and there's been some best-selling books out there, Vanished in the Woods, stories of people disappearing in national parks. This is a problem, and it's not precisely connected to UFOs in an evidentiary way. And by that I mean people who have gone missing are not necessarily abductees that we know of, or waves of sightings happening at the time someone disappears. So it's hard to connect this directly to the UFO phenomena in the vast majority of missing persons cases. But there are so many missing people that it's not at all completely attributable to murder and abduction, suicide, and running away, and the other explanations for missing people. There's too many. And there are certain areas, national parks in particular, have been pointed to as having a disproportionately high number of human disappearances. So this could be attributed to ETs, certainly, the not nice kind, presumably, or a human element as well, because there is genetic research going on that's black budget.
We had to reschedule David Paulides' interview, but in preparation for that, I got a copy from him from Missing 401, the Western United States and Canada, because I wanted to focus on California. Preston, I am shocked. I mean, in the proximity, me and you live within 20, 50 miles. There are so many cases of people literally walking with their child, and age doesn't matter. You'll see from a 2-year-old to a 70-year-old just gone without a trace, and it just mind-boggling. It's almost as if they either slipped into another dimension or they were zapped into the sky by some craft.
Yeah, we don't know. I hesitate to point to the UFO phenomena here because we don't have a UFO hovering over these areas when people are disappearing. And maybe it's because, they can turn themselves invisible. And since there are a number of cases where, people, there was a case like in New Mexico. A farmer drives home, this is over Hobbs, New Mexico, back in 1974, I believe it was. He pulls up to his driveway and there's a UFO hovering right over him, pulls him and his truck up inside of it. He was never heard from again. So there are cases that you can directly point to UFO abductions where people are not returned. And it makes perfect sense that, it's a wide universe. There are all kinds of people on our planet, and there's probably all kinds of people off our planet. There's no reason at all. I mean, if we're not protected against, this sort of phenomena, it can be attributed to ETs. But it's not my area of expertise. I don't have a lot of knowledge on it. But I've read a few of the books, and the UFOs are not in there. They're just not. It's a complete mystery what's going on here.
Back to the question that Rolf Pfeiffer Muller was asking. Let me find it here. The original was about the Branton files, and he expands. He says he's referring to the works of Alan Bruce DeWalton, one of the prominent UFO researchers, and VAL. Valerian Matrix series outstanding books. Do you know that?
Yeah, those are conspiracy focused, I would say, and I don't know. I know I've heard of Valerian. Yeah, it talks about the deal that our government made with exchanging technology for allowing abductions to happen, which does appear to be true, as that came out early on, and all the evidence that's come out since then has seemed to sort of corroborate that. But it's still speculation at this point. We don't have official confirmation that our government did in fact did this, coming from our government, I mean.
Now, let me pick a couple more chapters while people write in the chat, since we are cutting it close. I'm going to focus on, let's see, now I'm going to go to chapter 9. A 9-foot-tall alien with orange hair. Tell us about that.
It's an extraordinary case. This Nebraska housewife had just had her baby not too long ago, and she started to suffer this hypoglycemic type illness. She was a little overweight, but was losing weight rapidly, and it was not a good news, because she kept passing out if she didn't eat, and then she would pass out after she ate. She went to the doctor. They're like, no, you don't have diabetes, which did run in her family. No, you don't have hypoglycemia. We don't know what you have. And she was back and forth to the doctors and just getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and was to the point where she was afraid to sleep alone or be alone, and was walking through her home one evening when suddenly she was no longer in her home. She was in what appears to be an underground base or area. She's not sure why she felt that, but she was in a very large chamber, like a gymnasium-sized, huge, with a roundish ceiling, indirect lighting. It was very bright. Couldn't see where the light was coming from. That's a clue I've heard a million times. But this was weird. Here's where it got really strange. She was in a cubicle on a table. She looked down at the carpet. It was industrial carpet, like in an office. She looks out the cubicle wall, and she sees a man in a cubicle across the way there. And he's wearing a plaid shirt. He's very dazed. A young man. He's conscious, but barely, kind of like she is, trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And she peers up, and there are hundreds of these cubicles. And each of them appears to have a person in them. And there are figures walking up and down the corridors. And she sees one of these figures coming towards her. And it's not human. It's wearing a cape. It's got this weird black shiny clothes on. She wasn't really paying attention to that. She was paying attention to the fact that it was 8 feet tall and had this weird looking face. It had a giant chin, huge forehead, very strange eyes, and, well, we'll call it hair, but it wasn't hair like we think of it. It was more like straw, she said. It stuck straight up. It was very thick, about 3 inches, and bright orange. And this thing comes bounding down the hall right up to her cubicle. The guy next to her passes out. He's got a very terrified expression on his face. And she starts screaming because this being turns to her and says, "It's your turn now, Jill." And that sent her into a panic. It takes this cape-like thing, wraps it around her body, puts these silver-like, bell-like instruments on her body, which start pulsating this energy. And she's screaming. She's had this visceral terror. She's out of control. Next thing she knows, she's not even there anymore. She's back in her living room, exactly where she had been taken. Runs to her husband, tries to wake him up, can't wake him up. Runs to her children, tries to wake them up, can't wake them up. Says the Lord's Prayer, and tries for the next half an hour to wake her family up, and finally succeeds. Tells them what happened, and they're like, "Oh my God, They were very supportive of her. And following that incident, she was very sore the next morning. She could feel exactly where those instruments had been on her body. And she went to get something to eat and was fine. And it was about halfway through the day when she realized that she hadn't passed out once. Didn't pass out at all that day or the next or ever since. She gained weight and her condition completely stabilized. And she was essentially instantly cured of whatever illness she had. Now, this was followed up by further encounters. And as I interviewed her, it turned out she has a long history of encounters stretching to childhood with grays.
Wow. So in this part, she remembered consciously. That's why you wrote in this entire book is from conscious recall. So I'm assuming when she was in her living room and then was all of a sudden in this gymnasium-sized building with the industrial carpet, did she like sort of slip into another dimension?
It's hard to say. She was, as they say, among abductee lingo, she was pulled. That's kind of how they like to call it. Taken is another word, because we don't know precisely what's happened. But I do think when someone's taken on board a UFO, it is essentially another dimension. And the reason I say that is because there's some accounts of crashed UFOs from whistleblowers where they go inside these things, and they're twice the size they are on the inside than they are on the outside. Or when they go inside, time flows differently. Or they go inside and they can see, and normally they have, nearsightedness or farsightedness, but not when they're in this thing. So there's something going on there for sure in terms of interdimensionality of these craft.
Now, I'm going to go to the giant grasshopper alien.
Yeah, this is a very interesting case. A lady named Jeannie, who was actually pretty active within the UFO field, didn't think she was having contact really at all, but did admit to some sort of strange nighttime experiences of strong interest in UFOs and dreams of UFOs invading our planet and showing up, and she's running around saying, they're here, they're here. And she has these dreams where she's leading people on board the craft, and it's just constant. So she was pretty interested in UFOs and started talking to researcher Daryl Sims about it.
That's right, yes. He was working with Implants for a while before that little schism between him and Roger Lear years ago.
Right. So he's like, Jeannie, these are signs of contact. You've probably had contact. She's like, well, does that mean like those weird people that are visiting me at night? He's like, what? Yeah, she's having she couldn't see them. She'd be half asleep and sort of in a quasi-awake state, and would have these beings visiting her and talking to her and giving her messages. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like E.T., Jeannie. And so she did go under hypnosis by Daryl Sims. She was pretty frightened to do so. And the reason she did is because she had this incident one night where she had gone out to dinner with her husband, now her ex-husband, and woke up in the middle of the night gagging and had this awful taste in her mouth. It wasn't garlic, kind of taste, well, she thought it might be, but she didn't even eat garlic that night. She rushes to the bathroom, she tries to rinse out her mouth, nothing will do it. It was a very strange incident. He's like, well, let's go to that. Let's hypnotize you to that. And that's what they did. This is the second case in the book involving hypnosis. And she recalled instantly a flash of this grasshopper-like being. And it had this cylinder-like instrument, and it appeared in her bathroom and was kind of ramming it down her throat. And she was screaming, and it was very uncomfortable. And it was a very terrifying memory, and she pulled out of it pretty quick, but was able to recall enough to where she saw that this thing was 6 to 8 feet tall and was not human. It looked more like a grasshopper or perhaps a praying mantis, and was just a very scary experience for her.
This actually reminds me, if it was Chicago or not, correct me on that part. You said this lady was jogging in the morning, and right in front of her while she's jogging in the dusk or dawn is this 15-foot tall praying mantis being on the street.
Yeah, this is, well, not Chicago, but close.
Close,
This is
okay.
O'Fallon, Illinois. It was not long after the O'Hare airport incident. And turns out this lady lives next to, gosh, is it Scott Air Force Base? I think it is, which might be a significant factor. I think it is. But she has this habit, she's a school teacher, a great witness, by the way, very lucid interview, very intelligent. She has a habit of exercising early in the morning. She loves to do it, go out with her dog around 4:30 when it's dark and no one's out and all the rabbits are popping by and little fox, and she often sees wildlife. She lives in a pretty rural area there. There's cornfields and so on. And loves just jogging down the street. And is doing this one morning and comes upon a T intersection where there is this large spotlight, a street light. There's no traffic on the road at this hour. And she sees what she first thought was a man on stilts walking down the road and instantly discarded that because there's just no way, for one thing, that would ever happen. And it wasn't a man. And this thing walks under the spotlight, and then she saw what it was. It was a praying mantis with a humanoid form, walking at a very brisk pace with, each step was a good, 7 feet or so, and walking very fast. Its head was bent down, had very large dark eyes, a kind of whitish gray body, featureless, and its head was swinging back and forth as if it was looking for something very intently. And her dog stopped and looked at it. She stopped and looked at it. This thing didn't see her, did not even notice her, she thinks, and its behavior seems to say that it didn't, because it kept on walking. And right when it kind of came out of the pool of light there, she runs forward and sees this thing is still walking, and she follows it. It's moving faster than she can. And she watches it, a couple of 100 yards up there. It turns to the right and into the cornfield and is gone.
Wow. And if the creature didn't see her, the question is was the creature seeing in a different dimension? Or for us, for instance, we can only see a small wavelength of light, right? What about all those other areas of light that we can't see but others can see? I'm wondering if that was the case with this creature. But again, unless we get an interview with it, how are we going to find out?
No, the dog saw it. She saw it. I think it was physically there.
That's what I'm saying. I'm wondering if the creature didn't see her. I mean, as far as the wave light.
I think it was just distracted. It was looking for something else. It had a mission. It doesn't expect people to be out there. And she's, when you're in a jogging state, it's very meditative, and she's not projecting thoughts. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That can be picked up on by someone who's telepathically sensitive. But yeah, she was a great witness. I'm like, well, did you go out jogging the next morning? She's like, of course I did.
Really? No fear. Right. No fear. Here's a question for you from Ward Alien Video. Do you think the aliens are ramping up for something big? He believes they are.
It feels like it. Certainly a number of or abductees feel this way, and have been told specifically that, yes, there is an so-called event coming up. And I've heard it, like I described earlier, as moving to the fifth dimension or raising a vibration. Some people take a religious viewpoint towards the ETs and feel like there's going to be a rapture type event. I don't know if any of this is true, because there seems to have been a lot of this sort of predictive element by the ETs for a very long time. And we haven't seen anything that's been super earth-shaking. On the other hand, it's very difficult to say. We do see a sort of a ramping up of our awareness of UFOs. We see a ramping up of the disclosure movement. We see an escalation of activity. I'm going to stick to that. I don't think it's just our awareness. I think we have greater waves of UFO activity than we've ever had in human history before. Certainly since 1947, what's been going on is absolutely unprecedented. And I don't see them going away. And if they're not going away, well, that means there's one direction it's going, and that's moving towards open official contact. And that would be earth-shaking, and I do think it's going to happen. I'm not sure when or how or what level. To a certain extent, it already has happened in terms of, the Eisenhower meeting at Edwards, meetings at Holloman, meetings at other places like Rendlesham. So there has been what we would term open official contact with our leaders, but it's not with the public at large. And when that happens, boy, it's going to be a different world. And I do think that there's a strong possibility that that's going to occur within, gosh, tomorrow, 5 years, the next decade, 20 years, 40 years at the outlier. I just can't see this being covered up that long. 40 years? No.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can't imagine it be approaching 2060 and us still being in the dark, considering our technological achievements that are literally ramping out so darn fast. They can't cover this up forever. I mean, I understand the national security reasons. Okay, sure, we can't protect you from what's coming in the sky, but we also have no evidence that they're here to take over, like you mentioned earlier. So, like you said, I would really hope, like you said, it could be tomorrow or 5 years or 10 years, but I'm shocked, really shocked, if I'm approaching my 80s and we still haven't had this. So anyhow, Preston, I would love to continue on with you. We have so much more we could talk about just in this book alone, let alone the other 22 books. But since we are out of time, I'm going to turn it to you to make a final statement and to plug in your website and where people can find your books.
Hey, I appreciate it, Dr. J. And first of all, let me say thanks for having me on the show. I always appreciate it. It's awesome speaking with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, this is a subject I take very seriously, and I wish people would understand how serious it really is. If we can get this technology released that we already have, it will solve the energy crisis, the economic crisis, and the environmental crisis really a lot more easily, and that's so important. It's the number one message from ETs is our environment. So I think that's something we should definitely focus on in terms, from a political standpoint. I do wish people would garden more. Think about going solar. Worry about water purification. Water is going to become more and more valuable. So this is the sort of thing that, it's kind of why I'm in this field. I really wish the government would disclose and I could move on to, writing science fiction or something. But until they do, I am in here for the long haul. I've got more books coming up. I'm doing another volume of Not From Here, Volume 4, all about the more unusual outlying aspects of the UFO phenomena. I've got another book coming up about very much like Inside UFOs, about cases of close contact. And all my books are available on my website. If you Google my name, it'll take you there. The address is prestondennett.weebly.com. I've got that new Writers of the Future book out just now. Latest book out is The Healing Power of UFOs, 300 True Accounts, which I think is just monumental evidence proving that ETs are not only here on our planet, but one of their primary missions is the healing of humanity. I just don't see how you can deny it.
Well said, especially now, especially since you have celebrities and other government officials finally talking about this. This isn't right after World War II when people were shutting down because we just came out of the war and they're super patriots. People want to know, and that's one of the huge reasons that this show exists. And remember, for those of you who are listening, Preston is the entire reason this show exists. 6 years ago, this past March, me and Preston embarked on this show. Unfortunately, his time schedule couldn't keep up with the time they changed us to, but if you hear our original interviews, that's my co-host. And as you can hear from the very beginning of this, he is my mentor. The best books on this topic are written by Preston Dennett. I highly recommend you folks get them, especially if you live in one of those states where he's written a book, for instance, like UFOs over California or UFOs over New York. You want to read that to know what's happening. Okay, let me give some shout-outs. We have Joe Montaldo, station owner of UPRN. Shout out to him. Also, I want to thank iHeartMedia and JC of Deprogrammed Radio Network. I also want to thank Pam Vrettenberg, who is my social media manager, as well as my artist and moderator. Check out her website, UnitedTruthSeekers.com. I also want to thank Joshua Cheris, my assistant producer and VP of Operations. And of course, I want to thank the great Preston Dennett. Always new information. No, not one interview has ever been the same. And that's the greatest thing, Preston. We could talk for days on end, months on end, years on end, uninterrupted, and still new information is going to come about. I want to thank all you fine people in the chat. Thank you guys for your support, and definitely thank you all for participating in this conversation. This show is about you folks and all the listeners in general. Remember, as I always say, disclosure is in your hands, friends. Take the information, take what Preston said, take this interview and share it with somebody. There may be somebody that you know that's a skeptic or doesn't believe in it. Show them how serious this is. This is happening. This has been happening. It's going to continue happening. And you know what? You want to know. That way when everybody knows, you're not left behind. You can say, aha, I knew this back then. So with that being said, folks, this is Dr. J. Join us tomorrow and same place, same time.